Today I'm sharing the process for how I made this digital illustration titled The Witch and the Mean Girls. I painted this in early 2024 and it took about 16 hours to complete in total. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Alex, I'm a professional artist, and now let's get into the painting process. I always start out by making one or a few thumbnails of the illustration just to kind of try out the idea before I start and to play around with a rough composition. When I'm happy with the thumbnail, I proceed with a detailed sketch, and that sketch is what you're currently seeing here behind what I'm painting. And this phase that I'm in right here, just at the beginning, is what I like to refer to as the blockout phase. I am basically just building up all of the different shapes in the illustration, starting from the major shapes and then adding smaller and smaller shapes until everything in the scene is sort of in place. And at the same time, I'm also working on my layer structure and basically making sure that all of the different layers are organized properly so that I won't run into any technical problems later on when they are much harder to fix. In broad strokes, it basically just means that I'm keeping all of the different objects in the scene separated in a way that best serves me, and that everything is named and sorted into folders so that I can find things easier. This kind of layer structure might sound a bit complicated or excessive to some, but it's just one of those industry best practices that I see a lot of value in, to the point where I also like to use it in my personal work. A strong layer structure, in my opinion, is just easier to work with. I try to keep the base shape of all the objects on one layer each as much as possible, but sometimes it's just easier to separate things. For example, in this painting I separated different chunks of hair of the different characters because I knew that it would make it much easier to do the shading later on. But for most of the objects here, they're just one shape on their own layer. At this point, I'm not concerning myself with the colors in any way at all. I'm more or less choosing random colors that somewhat go in the right direction, but the main function of the colors at this stage is just to visually separate the objects for me. With the layer structure that I'm setting up here in the blockout phase, recoloring things later is very easy. I also think that it's quite nice to just not have to juggle so many things at the same time. Making an entire illustration, especially one that's very detailed, can feel quite overwhelming if you have to think about absolutely everything all at once. And this way, all I need to worry about at this early stage is just blocking out good shapes. Once the blockout phase is done, I move into the next phase, which is the detail pass. Generally, this means that I'm starting to give these big shapes secondary shapes and outlines where they're needed, or simply where they look good. For a character, that means, for example, painting in the face and individual pieces of clothing. But I'm generally not shading anything just yet. No lights, no shadows, just basic shapes and basic colors. In this stage, I also adjust the blockout colors from the previous phase and push the painting just a little bit more towards where I want it to be color-wise. It's a quite slow and gradual process, and a lot of decisions that I'm making here are related to readability. I want to make sure that important elements pop, which means that the colors and shapes around them should create a good contrast in both color and value. For example, a light green object should not be on a light green background. Instead, I want that light green object to be put against a darker red object. That would make the green object stand out more because it creates a contrast both in color, as in red and green being contrast colors, and also in value because you have a light and a dark object. The witch character, being one of the main actors of the scene, is one of those important objects that I want to pop. So at this stage you can see that her green-blue hair is intentionally placed against a purple locker. With that said, you can actually quite successfully place an object on a background of the same color and still make it pop. It's a bit harder, but the principle is more or less the same. So you need to create as much contrast as possible between the two different objects, and a good way to do that is to create contrast in both value, light and dark, and also color temperature, warm and cold. So for example, if you put a pink object on a pink background, you'll want to make sure that one of the objects is darker and one is lighter, and also that their hues are pulling in different direction. One of them might be a warmer pink going towards orange, while the other one is a colder pink going towards purple. And you'll see later on that I actually ended up turning the lockers green after all, and the reason was that I needed to boost the readability of the green smoke and the tentacle creature, and the green and white of the wall just wasn't working. It was more or less the same value, and it just didn't work out. So I inverted it and turned the wall purple and the lockers green. But then I made the lockers a darker, colder green, and the character's hair is a lighter and warmer green. The detail pass is quite often the longest phase for me for creating an illustration, especially in this case since there's so many different characters and objects in the scene. But I'm just going through the objects one at a time, starting with the most important ones and slowly going through the less important ones. The phase also requires very little brain power for me. It's quite relaxing, but it can also feel a little bit slow sometimes, so I like to put on a podcast or play a documentary in the background just to keep my mind entertained while I'm working. The idea behind this illustration, or the inspiration for it, was quite random. I was at the movies. I don't even remember what I was there to watch, probably something animated if I know myself. And before the movie started, there were a bunch of ads and trailers playing, and one of those trailers was for a remake of the Mean Girls movie. And for some reason, this idea just popped into my head of a teenage witch being in the lead role of this kind of movie, and it just seemed like a fun middle grade or young adult plot. And that's how this illustration came to be. I imagine that the witch is living some kind of double life, having her witch studies on the side of regular life, and somehow something went wrong, and once she returns to her lockers after class, she realizes that some spell has gone off and now there are all these creatures escaping from her locker. Meanwhile, everyone else is returning from class as well, and they're just a few steps away from finding her in this very strange, awkward position where she will probably reveal the existence of witches to everyone. I'm really curious what she'll do to try and avert this crisis. Personally, I have no idea, so please drop a comment and tell me what you think she'll do to get out of this situation. I still haven't figured it out, and I would love to know how this story ends. After I'm done with the detail pass, the next phase I'm entering into is the lighting pass. This is where I start to paint in lights and shadows and just a general atmosphere of the scene. For this particular illustration, I struggled quite a bit in the beginning since I had a very specific lighting scenario in mind, but I couldn't find a good way to implement it. Basically, I wanted the witch to be in a dark, unlit corridor as opposed to the sunlit hallway where all the other kids are. But the problem was that the lighting scenario reduced the readability of the witch in the foreground, while the sunlit hallway in the background stole all the attention. I tried a lot of different things for a good long while, but I couldn't really solve the problem. So what I did was I stepped away from the painting and started a new document where I created a bunch of different color concepts focusing specifically on resolving the lighting issue. I tried lighting the corridor in a lot of different colors like purple and red and a lot of different shades of blue. And I also tried adding a secondary light source, like having one single lamp overhead, or seeing the light from an open door, or another lit hallway from the left. In the end, none of those ideas created the effect that I wanted, so I actually went back to the original lighting scenario that I had thought of and just worked a lot with the readability, pushing the colors and values to a point where it just kind of worked. I brightened up a lot of those crucial areas with just a hint of sort of a blue, faint blue light. And it also really helped when I added the green rim light from the smoke and a subtle blue rim light from the other direction as well. When the problem was resolved, I made a final push toward the finish line. Most of the colors at this point were more or less where I wanted them to be, but I still did a lot of changes and simplifications to the background. Most of the work at this point, as I mentioned, revolved around getting those lights in the scene and creating just the right atmosphere and feeling. There's also a little bit of shading going on, mostly on the background, the foreground, including the witch and all of the other characters there. I really like how the colors turned out in the end. I think it looks really nice with the greens and blues in the foreground and the yellow, pinks and purples in the background. It was also a really fun piece to do with all this environmental storytelling going on. One of my favorite details is the mess of objects scattered across the floor in front of the witch character. You can almost picture how just a few seconds earlier she turned the corner, noticed the situation and just dropped everything in order to try and close the locker before everything in it escaped into the school. I've actually noticed that a lot of artists are very interested in creating characters, and there's understandably a lot of focus on them. But in my opinion, the environments can be just as interesting and expressive and have a lot of different stories to tell. And here's the final painting. I hope this demonstration was interesting or inspiring to you, and if anything is unclear or if you have any questions about something, don't hesitate to write me in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.